The fluorescent lights of Briarwood General Hospital's ICU cast harsh shadows over Alyssa Carter's pale face as Shadow pressed his nose against the observation window. Something was wrong. The Belgian Malinois' amber eyes followed Dr. Preston's every movement, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. "Easy, boy," Officer Daniel Cruz murmured, giving the leash a slight tug. But Shadow didn't relax. His ears remained pinned back, his body rigid with tension. Through the glass, Alyssa lay motionless, surrounded by beeping monitors and IV drips. Just 12 hours ago, she and Shadow had been on their usual patrol at Westbridge International Airport, moving through the maze of terminals and security checkpoints. Shadow had been the first to catch the scent, that sharp, chemical tang that always signaled danger. Alyssa, trusting her partner's instincts as she had for 5 years, had followed his lead. They'd tracked a suspect to Terminal B, where a routine cargo inspection had unraveled into something far more sinister. Now, Alyssa was fighting for her life, and Shadow couldn't shake the feeling that the danger hadn't passed. Dr. Preston adjusted the flow of medication in Alyssa's IV line, and Shadow's growl intensified. Daniel pulled gently on the leash, but the canine officer refused to move. There was something eerily familiar about the doctor's movements, something that triggered a memory from the airport. But Shadow couldn't make his human partner understand. "I know you're worried about her," Daniel said, kneeling beside him. "We all are, but she's in good hands." The words meant nothing to Shadow. All he knew was that the same scent from the airport, chemical, dangerous, wrong, now clung to Dr. Preston's scrubs. And every time the doctor entered Alyssa's room, her vitals inexplicably declined. At the nurse's station, Dr. Olivia Chang, a young resident, noticed Shadow's unusual behavior. She had worked with therapy dogs in the pediatric ward and knew that police canines operated on a completely different level. This wasn't anxiety, and it wasn't just separation distress. This was something else. "Has he been acting like this around all the medical staff?" she asked, approaching Daniel carefully. "No, ma'am," he replied. "Just started today, and only with..." A piercing alarm from Alyssa's monitor cut him off. Through the glass they saw Dr. Preston rush to her bedside, barking orders as her vitals plummeted. Shadow lunged forward with such force that Daniel nearly lost his grip on the leash. The dog's bark rang through the sterile hallway, a sound Alyssa would have recognized immediately. It wasn't his alert for narcotics or explosives. This was his warning. The same warning he had given seconds before the gunfire erupted at the airport. Dr. Chang's eyes narrowed as she watched Dr. Preston hurriedly adjust Alyssa's IV. "Officer Cruz, how long have you known Dr. Preston?" she asked, her voice low. "Since Alyssa was admitted last night," he said. "Why?" Dr. Chang's expression darkened. "I've worked in this ICU for 3 years," she said slowly, "and I've never seen him before today." Shadow's barking escalated to a fever pitch as Dr. Preston glanced toward the observation window. For a split second, his gaze met Shadow's, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, fear, hatred. Then suddenly he was moving, fast and purposeful, toward the service elevator at the end of the hall. "Stop him," Dr. Chang shouted. But Shadow was already in motion. 5 years of training, countless hours of pursuit drills, all led to this moment. The imposter had hurt his partner once. He wouldn't get a second chance. The elevator doors were closing when Shadow yanked free from his leash. Daniel's shout and Dr. Chang's gasp faded behind him as he bolted down the hallway, claws clicking against the polished floor. He had only one chance to stop what his instincts had been warning him about all along. Alyssa had always said Shadow was more than just a police dog. He was her guardian angel. And as he launched himself through the narrowing gap of the elevator doors, Shadow knew one thing for certain. Guardian angels don't take coffee breaks. And they sure as hell don't give up on their partners. The last thing Daniel and Dr. Chang heard before the doors slammed shut was the unmistakable sound of Shadow's powerful jaws meeting their target, followed by a very human scream of pain and surprise. The hunt that had begun at Westbridge International was about to end in an elevator at Briarwood General. Dr. Olivia Chang pushed through the growing crowd, her face set with determination. "Check his ID, now," she ordered. She had already called the real ICU attending physician, who was currently rushing back from his lunch break. The man everyone had known as Dr. Preston had spent nearly an hour alone in Alyssa Carter's room, reviewing her charts and adjusting her IV. The security guard yanked a wallet from the suspect's pocket, flipping it open to reveal an ID card. The name on it read Nathan Bell, an orderly from an entirely different hospital. Shadow's growl deepened as Officer Daniel Cruz read the name aloud. "Get a tox screen on Carter's blood, now," Dr. Chang ordered, already moving back toward the ICU, "and lock down her room. No one in or out without my direct authorization." Daniel kept a firm grip on Shadow's leash as they followed. The K-9 officer's instincts warred with his training. He wanted to stay and guard the prisoner, but Alyssa needed him more. The elevator doors slid closed on Nathan Bell's face, his expression twisted in pain, and something darker. He wasn't talking, but his eyes said enough. This wasn't over. Back in the ICU, Alyssa's room had become a flurry of movement. The real Dr. Victor Reynolds, 30 years older than the imposter and sporting a signature bow tie, studied her charts with growing concern. "These medication orders," he muttered, his brows knitting together. "They're all wrong. Look at these dosages." Shadow whined softly, pressing against Daniel's leg. The handler knew that sound. It was Shadow's way of signaling that something was wrong when he couldn't bark or scratch to indicate a location. Dr. Chang noticed too. "What is it, boy?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "What are you trying to tell us?" Shadow's sharp gaze locked onto the small refrigerator in the corner of the room, the one used to store temperature-sensitive medications. Dr. Chang followed his line of sight, then hesitated. "Wait," she said, stopping halfway. "Officer Cruz, can you have Shadow check this area, like he would in the field?" Daniel nodded, understanding instantly. "Search Shadow. Find it." Released from his formal position, Shadow moved methodically around the refrigerator, his nose working overtime before he stopped abruptly, sat, and stared at the unit's base. The universal K-9 signal, target located. A maintenance worker pried open the refrigerator's bottom panel. Inside, taped to the compressor, was a small package. Several vials of clear liquid, unmarked except for a tiny symbol that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The same tattoo they had glimpsed on one of the drug runners at Westbridge International Airport, just before everything had gone to hell. "Son of a," Daniel muttered, pulling out his phone. "This goes way beyond a random attack," Dr. Chang whispered, documenting everything. "They followed her here." The real question was, how many more of them were out there? And what exactly had Officer Carter stumbled onto at that airport? Shadow's ears twitched. A shadow passed across the small window in the ICU door. The night shift was just beginning, and Shadow never let his guard down. Fear wasn't the same as being broken. Shadow remembered the first time Alyssa had challenged him with a puzzle box filled with treats. Other handlers used simple food rewards. Alyssa made him think. "Bad guys don't play fair," she had told him, watching as he worked out the complex locking mechanism. "We need to be smarter, faster, and trust each other completely." A noise in the hallway snapped Shadow back to the present. His ears pricked forward. An orderly wheeled a medication cart past the door. Every member of the night staff had been triple-checked since the incident with the imposter doctor. But Shadow wasn't taking any chances. Not after what had happened at the airport. His mind wandered again, to their first real bust together, tracking a suspect through an abandoned office building. The moment the floor gave way beneath Alyssa's feet, Shadow had ignored every training protocol, breaking his position to seize her tactical vest with his teeth, holding on until backup arrived. The department had wanted to reprimand her for not enforcing strict K-9 protocols. "My dog, my rules." Alyssa had told them. He made a judgment call. "I'm alive because he thinks for himself." Thunder rumbled outside the hospital windows, and Shadow tensed instinctively. Storms always took him back to that night, 6 months ago. The night everything started to unravel. Alyssa had been working late, reviewing cold cases. Shadow had dozed under her desk. The file had seemed routine, a smuggling operation from 5 years ago. But something in those papers had made Alyssa's heartbeat spike. Shadow had smelled her fear before she'd even realized she was afraid. That night, she had made 3 calls. The first, to her supervisor, went straight to voicemail. The second, to an unlisted number that Shadow had memorized from the way her fingers trembled. The third never went through. That was when they'd noticed the black SUV following them home, A soft moan from the hospital bed yanked Shadow back to the present. Alyssa's fingers twitched. For a moment, her eyelids fluttered. Shadow whined softly, pressing his nose against her hand. The doctors had reduced her sedation, hoping she would wake naturally, but they had warned it could take time. "She's fighting," Dr. Chang said quietly from the doorway, startling Shadow. He hadn't heard her approach. He was getting tired, just like Alyssa had fought for him when everyone else had given up on him. Shadow hadn't heard Dr. Olivia Chang approach. He was exhausted. "Just like you fought, didn't you?" she murmured as she checked Alyssa Carter's vitals in the dim light. Dark circles under the doctor's eyes told Shadow everything. She hadn't left the hospital, staying well past her shift to monitor Alyssa personally. Something about her quiet determination reminded him of his partner. The same refusal to accept things at face value. Dr. Chang exhaled softly, flipping through Alyssa's records. "I pulled her file," she muttered, half to herself, half to the dog. 5 years with the department, highest arrest record in the K-9 unit, but it's the small things that stand out. The complaints against her for digging too deep into routine cases. The notes about rehabilitating an aggressive dog no one else believed in. She looked down at Shadow. "You two weren't just doing your jobs, were you?" she whispered. "You were looking for something that got her shot." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white. For a split second, Shadow saw something else, a muzzle flash in a dark terminal. The sharp smell of gunpowder. Alyssa's body hitting the ground, the same chemical odor that had clung to the imposter doctor's clothes. Alyssa's fingers twitched again. This time, they curled weakly around Shadow's muzzle. Her breathing changed, shallow but faster. "Fighting." Dr. Chang rushed to check her pupils. "Officer Carter, Alyssa, can you hear me?" Shadow recognized the look on Alyssa's face. The same determination she'd had the day she refused to give up on him when everyone else had. She was coming back to him. And when she did, they would finish what they started. Because Alyssa had taught him more than just commands and protocols. She had taught him that some fights were worth any risk. That loyalty meant standing your ground, even when the odds were impossible. And that the most dangerous enemies weren't the ones who showed their teeth. They were the ones who smiled while reaching for the knife. Thunder rumbled outside, rattling the hospital windows. Somewhere in Westbridge, the people who had tried to kill his partner were realizing their plan had failed. They would come again, with new disguises, new tricks, new ways to silence what Alyssa had uncovered. But they didn't know what Shadow knew. That love was stronger than fear. That trust could outmatch any training. And that some partnerships ran soul deep. Alyssa had saved him once, given him a purpose when he had none. Now, it was his turn. Shadow backed away from the hospital bed, positioning himself between Alyssa and the ventilation grate in the corner of the room. That was when the scent hit him. Bitter. Chemical. Wrong. Daniel's voice was sharp. Gas. But Shadow was already in motion. With one leap, his jaws clamped down on the plastic fire alarm cover. The shrill sound of the alarm mixed with the sudden hiss from the vents. Emergency protocols kicked in instantly. Fire doors slammed shut. The hospital's ventilation system reversed, sucking the contaminated air out of the building. In the chaos of evacuation, no one noticed the dark-suited men slipping away, or the unmarked vans speeding out of the parking lot. Hours later, in a secure wing of Briarwood General Hospital across town, Alyssa Carter's eyes finally fluttered open. The room was unfamiliar, the view outside, different, but Shadow's head, resting on her bed, was exactly where it should be. "Hey, partner," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. Shadow's tail thumped against the floor as Dr. Chang rushed in to check her vitals. "Did we get them?" Alyssa asked. Daniel Cruz stepped into her line of sight. "Not all of them. Not yet." He exhaled. "But thanks to Shadow, we've got enough evidence to blow this whole thing wide open. The real task force is involved now. FBI, the legitimate one." Alyssa's fingers found Shadow's ear, scratching that special spot that always made his eyes close in contentment. "Good boy," she murmured. "I knew you'd figure it out." But Shadow kept one ear perked, one eye open. The game wasn't over. The people behind this had connections everywhere, resources they hadn't even discovered yet. And Alyssa Carter was still their loose end. Outside her room, Detective Marcus Vega coordinated with federal agents. Their radios crackled with updates. The story was already breaking across the news. A massive pharmaceutical smuggling ring, corrupt military contractors, compromised airport security. Yet, as the sun set on another Westbridge evening, Shadow knew the real battle was just beginning. Because somewhere in the city, a phone was ringing in a very exclusive office. And on the other end of that call, someone was very, very angry. They had tried to silence Alyssa with bullets. They had tried to silence her with poison. And they had failed. Shadow settled into position, watching the only entrance to the room. Let them try again. This time, he'd be ready. The emergency generators of Briarwood General hummed to life as the city grid went dark. One by one, entire blocks disappeared into the night, the blackout spreading like ink across the skyline. Shadow's ears pricked at the distant wail of sirens. From her hospital bed, Alyssa's voice was stronger now. "This isn't a coincidence," she murmured. She turned to Daniel, her eyes sharp, her body still weak, but her mind clear. "They're making their move." Dr. Olivia Chang checked the backup systems controlling Alyssa Carter's monitors. "Security's doubled on this floor," she murmured, "and we've got real FBI agents stationed at every..." She stopped mid-sentence. Shadow had suddenly risen to his feet, nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The Belgian Malinois moved to the door, his posture setting off every alarm in Alyssa's mind. This wasn't his usual alert stance for danger, this was something else. Recognition. Alyssa started to sit up, but Daniel Cruz gently pressed her back. "Stay down," he whispered, his hand shifting toward his service weapon. "What is it, boy?" The answer came in a cascade of failures. First, the backup generators stuttered. Then, the electronic locks on the secure ward clicked open. Finally, the computers at the nurses' station went dark, taking the security cameras with them. A slow, deliberate voice came from the doorway. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Chief Warren Beckett of the Westbridge Police Department stepped into the dim room, his badge catching the faint glow of emergency lighting. Two men in tactical gear flanked him, securing the hallway. The man Alyssa had trusted as her supervisor for 5 years looked different now. Colder, calculating. "You should have stayed unconscious, Carter," Beckett said as he closed the door behind him. "Would have been easier that way." Shadow's growl was low and thunderous, but he held his position, waiting for Alyssa's command. She had taught him patience in the face of betrayal. "How long?" Alyssa asked, her fingers inching toward the nurse call button. "How long have you been helping them move product through my airport?" Beckett laughed, bitter, worn, full of old regrets. "Your airport?" He shook his head. "That's always been your problem, Carter. Too territorial. Too many questions about cargo manifests that weren't your concern." Alyssa's voice hardened. "Those drugs are killing people. Kids are dying from whatever your military friends are cooking up in those labs." Beckett sighed and pulled out his gun. "It's bigger than drugs." He smiled then, and it was all teeth. "The pharmaceuticals? They're just the packaging." Shadow tensed. He was reading Alyssa's subtle hand signal. Years of partnership had taught them to communicate in silence. "Biological weapons," Alyssa murmured, the pieces clicking into place. "You've been hiding them in legitimate medical supplies." Beckett smirked. "Give the lady a prize." He raised his gun. "And now it's time for..." He never finished the sentence. Shadow launched. The dog's jaws clamped onto Beckett's gun arm just as Alyssa yanked the curtains closed, plunging the room into total darkness. Beckett's shot went wide, shattering the window. The chaos that followed was a symphony of snarls and shouts. Daniel tackled one of the tactical officers. Dr. Chang slammed her hand onto the emergency lockdown override, sealing the ward. Alyssa rolled from the bed, ignoring the fiery pain in her wounds. In the darkness, Shadow was a force of nature. Alyssa had trained him to fight smart, not just hard. He didn't go for the obvious attack. Instead, he seized Beckett's sleeve, dragging him off balance. The chief's head cracked against the edge of a medical cart with a sickening thud. But Beckett's men were professionals. One of them managed to grab Shadow in a chokehold, his tactical armor shielding him from the dog's teeth. Alyssa saw the glint of a knife. "Shadow F!" Their special command, the one she had designed just for him. Shadow feigned weakness for half a second, his body going limp. The moment his attacker loosened his grip, he exploded into motion. Using the man's own arm as a springboard, he launched himself at Beckett, who was struggling to his feet. Beckett's backup weapon clattered across the floor, spinning to a stop at Alyssa's feet. She didn't hesitate. Freeze! Her voice cracked like a whip. Shadow, hold. The Malinois' jaws locked onto Beckett's shoulder, not breaking skin, but promising much worse if he moved. The tactical team, seeing their leader pinned, froze in place. Then the cavalry arrived. Detective Marcus Vega led a joint FBI-ATF task force that had been watching the hospital, waiting for exactly this moment. As Beckett was dragged away in handcuffs, he turned to Alyssa, his expression twisted in fury. "You have no idea what you've started," he sneered. "There are people above me, above all of us. They'll never let this see the light of day." Alyssa scratched behind Shadow's ear as federal agents secured the room. "Maybe," she said, watching her former boss disappear into custody, "but they've never dealt with a partner like mine." Hours later, as the city's power gradually returned, Alyssa sat up in her hospital bed, Shadow's head resting in her lap. Dr. Chang carefully treated the scratches on the dog's side, but Shadow's eyes never left Alyssa's face. "You know what this means," Detective Vega said from the doorway. "We'll need you both to testify. There's going to be pressure, from places we can't even imagine." Alyssa smiled, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. "Let them come." She wasn't afraid, because that's what Beckett and his people had never understood. Shadow wasn't just a dog with good training. He was a survivor, a fighter who had learned to adapt against impossible odds. And Alyssa, she was the one person who had looked past his scars and seen the hero underneath. Together, they weren't just a canine unit, they were a promise kept, a trust unbroken, a force that no amount of corruption could silence. And they weren't finished yet. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Westbridge, painting the skyline in soft hues of hope as Alyssa Carter stood before the federal grand jury. 2 weeks had passed since the hospital showdown, and now the conspiracy was finally unraveling. Shadow sat perfectly still beside her witness chair, his presence a steady source of strength as she recounted everything they had uncovered. "It started with a scent," Alyssa explained, her voice clear and unwavering. "Shadow detected something unusual during a routine cargo inspection, a chemical compound that didn't match any known drug profiles in our database. The evidence was damning. Chief Warren Beckett's arrest had triggered a domino effect, exposing a network that stretched from Westbridge International Airport to military contractors across 3 continents. The modified pharmaceuticals weren't just designer drugs. They were prototypes for something far more sinister. They were using legitimate medical supply chains to test bioweapons, confirmed FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh, standing beside a display of seized evidence. Officer Carter and Shadow didn't just stop a drug operation, she continued, they prevented a potential global catastrophe. Meanwhile, at Briarwood General Hospital, Dr. Olivia Chang was implementing revolutionary changes. The hospital board had unanimously approved her proposal for an enhanced canine security program, with Alyssa and Shadow as special advisors. "The days of vulnerable medical facilities are over," Dr. Chang told her. Together, they watched as Shadow demonstrated detection techniques to a new team of hospital security dogs. "Your partner's instincts saved more than just your life," she added. "He showed us that sometimes the most powerful medical breakthrough is a wet nose and a willing heart." The investigation grew rapidly. Detective Marcus Vega's task force uncovered similar operations at airports across the country. One by one, corrupt officials and compromised contractors were taken down. But Alyssa knew the fight wasn't over. "They'll try again," she warned during a briefing with the FBI's bioweapons division. "Different airports, different methods, but they'll try." Shadow's ears perked up at the determination in her voice. He had been awarded the department's Medal of Valor, but the Belgian Malinois seemed more interested in something else, his new tactical vest, designed by Dr. Chang herself. Reinforced armor, built-in detection sensors. Alyssa smirked, adjusting the straps. "Let them try." Agent Walsh nodded. "Thanks to you two, we know what to look for now. Every major airport in the country is implementing your protocols." The changes were immediate and widespread. Hospitals across the nation adopted canine security teams, modeled after Shadow's instinct-driven approach. Airport screening procedures were transformed, focusing on the exact indicators Shadow had first detected. Alyssa and her partner had sparked a paradigm shift, one that would forever change how America protected its most vulnerable locations. Late that evening, Alyssa sat on her favorite bench in the hospital's rooftop garden, a peaceful retreat that Dr. Chang had designed for patients and staff alike. Shadow lay at her feet, ever vigilant, but, for once, relaxed. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling like fallen stars. "You know what, partner?" Alyssa murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. He let out a contented sigh. Sometimes, the biggest heroes are the ones who never stop believing in what they smell. Shadow's tail thumped against the ground. He didn't care about medals or commendations, or even the press conferences and policy changes his actions had inspired. He only understood what mattered. His partner was safe, his city was safer, and there would always be more bad guys to catch. The door behind them opened. Shadow's head snapped up, muscles tensing for a split second before he relaxed again. Dr. Chang stepped forward, holding 2 cups of coffee, and, more importantly, Shadow's favorite training treats. "The FBI called," she said, settling beside them. "They're expanding the program, nationwide. Every major hospital and airport will have a canine unit trained in your methods." Alyssa's gaze lifted toward the night sky. A plane took off from Westbridge International, its lights burning bright against the darkness. She smirked. "Hear that, Shadow? You're starting a revolution." The Malinois simply nestled closer, his body warm against hers. His eyes, however, never left the horizon. He didn't need to understand revolutions or legacies. He only needed to know that wherever Alyssa went, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because that's what partners do. Somewhere in the city below, the roar of jet engines cut through the night as a cargo plane touched down on the tarmac. Inside its hold, rows of unmarked crates sat in the dim light, ordinary at a glance, but holding secrets that demanded closer inspection. From her seat on the rooftop, Alyssa Carter exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the distant runway. Beside her, Shadow stirred, his ears flicked forward, his muscles tensed. Even before Alyssa spoke, he could sense it. The shift in her posture, the quiet focus in her breath. He knew that tone, that energy. She stood, stretching out the stiffness in her limbs. "Looks like we've got work to do, partner," she murmured. Shadow didn't need words. His tail gave a single steady thump against the ground before he rose to his feet, eyes locked on the horizon. The night was quiet for now. But out there, in the warehouses, the terminals, the hidden corners of the city, danger still lurked. People would try again. They always did. But that didn't matter, because they weren't alone anymore. Across the country, new K9 units were being trained. Hospitals had tighter security, airports had sharper eyes, and at the center of it all was Shadow. He wasn't just another K9 officer. He was living proof that instincts, loyalty, and trust could change everything. Some heroes wear capes, others wear badges, but the best ones? They wear fur and follow their noses straight into history. Shadow let out a quiet huff, standing tall as Alyssa adjusted her gear. Then, together, they walked toward the next battle, and neither of them looked back.